Alors, bonjour à tous, bonjour à toutes. Bienvenue à cette conférence internationale qui porte sur la coopération en matière de défense entre les démocraties face à la résurgence de l'autoritarisme. My name is Jonathan Paquin. I'm a professor of political science at Laval University in Quebec City, Canada. Welcome to this conference on Democratic Allies Defense Cooperation Against Authoritarianism in a Shifting World. This conference brings together experts from many countries and from many continents, scholars from Europe, from North America, mainly Canada, and the Asia-Pacific regions will take the floor to share their views and knowledge on defense cooperation among democracies. And of course, you can read the biographical notes of our 10 panelists on the conference program. But before going further, I would like to mention that this conference was made possible in large part by the financial support of the Mobilizing Insights in Defense and Security program from the Department of National Defense of Canada. So I would like to thank the department for its generous contribution. What is the state of defense cooperation among democracies in 2021? This is the central question of this conference. In today's world, America's allies must cope not only with the decline of America's hegemonic leadership, but also with the return to great power rivalry, as witnessed in Ukraine, Syria, and the South China Sea. China's military assertiveness and the resurgence of Russian military ambition raise questions regarding the defense strategies being put forward by US liberal allies. Now, following his election, US President Joe Biden has called for greater cooperation among democracies in the face of authoritarianism. Biden was quick to reassure East Asian and NATO allies of his administration's determination to strengthen US engagement with them. However, it is doubtful that this was enough to overcome the trauma of the Trump years. In fact, President Biden's decision to act unilaterally in the withdrawal from Afghanistan in August and the surprising creation of a strategic partnership with Australia and the United Kingdom, known as AUKUS, in September, behind the back of other democratic allies and notably France, undermined Biden's initial attempt to pick up the pieces with its allies. These tensions between allies come 3 years before the next US presidential election in 2024, which could very well bring a Trumpist Republican or Donald Trump himself to the White House. And so in this context, tough questions must be asked. First, do democratic allies share sufficient strategic interests and trust to keep in check the revisionist powers like China and Russia? Do democratic allies have a sufficiently coherent defensive force to deter rival powers? And finally, in the event that America should go inward again in 2024, would US allies be sufficiently coordinated to present a common front to defend the established international order and to defend our values and our principles? As threats multiply and diversify, we wonder what are the political dynamics that are driving the relationship between democracies in 2021 on defense issues. Are they strengthening their cooperation? And if so, is this translating into policy convergence between them? If it's the case, where is defense cooperation occurring and how far is it being taken? Is this cooperation mainly regional within the European Union or among Indo-Pacific allies? Or is it truly global from Tokyo to Canberra, London, and Berlin? In the event where we would not see more convergence between democratic allies, are we witnessing the opposite dynamic, that is, towards policy divergence and strategic autonomy? If so, is this state of affairs due to a decision on the part of US allies to cultivate political ambiguity with respect to great powers, to hedge their bets in hoping to maximize their gains in an international system that is increasingly uncertain? If so, in what area and to what extent? So these are the questions guiding today's discussions. In a few minutes, we will turn to our first panel chaired by Alexander Lanoszka to discuss Europe's defense dilemma. Discussions on a stronger and more capable European defense that would be complementary to NATO is a recurring theme in Europe, but one that was discussed much more seriously following the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And of course, the bitter row over submarine contracts and the surprising creation of AUKUS probably accelerated these discussions. Then following our first panel, just before lunch, retired Brigadier-General Richard Giguère will deliver the keynote address. General Giguère will talk about surprise as a principle of war, and more specifically about the fall of Kabul and the creation of AUKUS as elements of surprise. Then after lunch in the afternoon, Andrea Charon will chair our second panel on Canada's defense cooperation at a time when its major democratic partners are discussing their strategic future among themselves. As Europeans talk about strategic autonomy and as AUKUS was announced, a month and a half ago, are we witnessing declining alliance prospects for Canada? Are we, in other words, missing the boat here? And finally, our last panel, chaired by Cleo Pascal, will deal with defense cooperation among Asia-Pacific allies and their strategic relations with America and Europe. Je vous souhaite donc un excellent colloque, une excellente conférence. Without further ado, I now invite Alexander Lanoszka to take the floor to introduce the speakers of our first panel. Alexander?
Thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this first panel discussion and for asking really difficult and provocative questions that will frame the conversations that we'll be having over the course of today. My name is Alexander Lanoszka. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo, though I'm currently at Sciences Po Bordeaux as part of my sabbatical for this academic term. I'll be keeping my remarks extremely short. We're going to do something a little different than what appears in the program. We're going to have Olivier Schmitt discuss firstly, but because he has an engagement at about 1700 Central European time, we're going to have a question and answer period right after his remarks. And then after that session, or that part of the session, we're going to have Dominika Kunertova come give her remarks, and then Andrew Dorman will then speak. And then 20 to the hour, we're going to have another question and answer period for both of those presentations. I would like to note that there is an interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. So if you would like to have a French translation of the remarks or an English translation, please avail yourself of that service. And in the Q&A sessions, please use the Q&A or Q&R function in the Zoom box. Well, without further ado, I invite Olivier Schmitt to offer his remarks. Olivier?
Thank you, Alex, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. If you don't mind, I'm just going to say a few words in French pour remercier mes collègues et amis québécois de m'avoir invité à participer à cette conférence. Je suis très heureux de pouvoir contribuer avec mes moyens limités aujourd'hui à ce qui, je pense, est une discussion importante. Et voilà, donc je vous remercie de m'avoir invité à participer aujourd'hui. So back to English, as Alexander mentioned, unfortunately, I will have to leave at 5 because I've got one of those unexpected meetings that pops up just before the weekend, and one of those I cannot miss. So I'm very sorry for disturbing the program a little. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to try to provide you with a sense of what the political climate in Paris is right now regarding alliances and defense partnerships. But to do that, I'm first gonna try to give you some context on French alliances policies and how perceptions of what alliances are actually shape contemporary policies, how internal politics tends to shape contemporary policies. So the goal of my presentation is to try to review current issues in alliance politics from a French perspective in light of those broad shaping factors I'm going to talk about right now. So one of the key first shaping factor I want to talk about is that NATO is the key alliance for French security. There is no doubt about that. But I'm also not going to surprise anyone when I say that it's a complicated relationship that Paris has with NATO. I'm not going to trace the history of that relationship because I assume that most of you are familiar with it. But I'm going to insist on three different aspects which are mutually reinforcing. The first one is a long-standing understanding that in France, actually, that NATO fulfills parts of France's security needs, but not all of France's security needs, including issues in the Sahel, including in Africa. So while in the French view, while for some European countries, security equals NATO because NATO is the entire provider of the scope of what matters to them, for French decision makers, they tend to think that there is NATO, but there will always need to be something else because NATO does not cover the entirety of our security needs. The second broad and important shaping factor to keep in mind is that France does not entirely believe in the US security guarantee. So this is why there is the policy of nuclear deterrence, which is based on this very strong memory from World War II of never again being invaded. There is also another strong memory of World War II, which still nowadays shapes the relationship with the US and the UK. One of the strong recurring memory which still shape political discourses is that in the interwar period, France sought security guarantees from the US and the UK, but did not receive them. And there is a French narrative that in some way, the US and the UK enabled the rise of Nazi Germany and underplayed the gravity that was the Vichy regime for French security. And I think there was just this new book by Michael Nieberg, When France Fell, which is looking at how the US reacted to the Vichy regime and basically, running around to almost recognize it because they didn't know what to do. But in the French political discourse since then, there has been the sense that France was alone in the interwar period. And France was also alone in the fighting. There is a strong sense, and I'm not saying that it's true, I'm saying it's part of the memories, right? But there is a strong sense that the UK contribution was minimal and even counterproductive, and that the French army had to actually sacrifice itself to protect the British forces which were withdrawing at Dunkirk. And when you read Marc Bloch's Strange Defeats, which is basically the book that totally shaped the memory of World War II, he has extremely critical lines about British soldiers, which are basically portrayed as loitering, cowards, cowardly, not fighting. But I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying that because of the importance of the book, it shaped the memory of what it was to be in an alliance for many generations of French policymakers. There is also a third thing which I think is maybe more difficult to capture, but which is really prevalent in even nowadays in French discourses, is what I would call the alliance poison trap. In the sense that it's mostly articulated by de Gaulle, but it still carries on afterwards, is that there is this notion that if a nation becomes accustomed to relying on another country to fulfill some of its security needs, there is a risk of becoming trapped, especially because dependence on allied and friendly powers is rarely irksome enough to precipitate some form of resistance. So there is this notion of if we believe too much in the alliance, we are going to become complacent about our own defense. So we cannot afford becoming complacent, therefore we cannot trust the alliance too much. And all those aspects about not fully believing the US security guarantee leads contemporary French policymakers to basically say we should take the US seriously when they say that they are disengaging from Europe. We should take that seriously because it will happen in one way or another, and probably sooner than later. There is a third dimension in the French understanding of alliances, which is that France firmly believes in a distinction between NATO as an organization and the transatlantic alliance as a political commitment. So there is this notion that NATO is a tool serving a broader political purpose, and we don't need to be committed to a tool which can be discarded if it becomes obsolete. All what matters is the political purpose of the transatlantic alliance. For any other country within NATO except France, it makes no sense, right? And already in the 60s, when de Gaulle was trying to explain that to the UK and the US, it did not make sense to them. Because for many countries, NATO is basically the signal of the strength of the transatlantic relationship. But for French policymakers, this is deeply ingrained in how they think about the alliance, which is about the transatlantic relationship, and NATO, which is just an organization. And so, for example, I took this line from Mira Rapp-Hooper's book, Shields of the Republic, which is about alliances, right? And so she, to me, she perfectly captures the US perception of it when she says about France's withdrawal from the military integrated command in 1966. She writes, France was refusing to contribute to the alliance, even as it continued to claim to the alliance protection. But for it strikes me as really tone deaf, because really it's really not how French policymakers saw it. For French policymakers, they still made a substantial contribution to the alliance, because in 1967 there is the Eyre-Lemnitzer Agreement, which is organizing the way the French armed forces are going to participate in military operations in case of a Soviet invasion. France is also pushing to get its French nuclear deterrence recognized as contributing to NATO deterrence at the Ottawa summit in 1974. So in the French view, they were still contributing to the alliance. It's not because you're not in the integrated command that you're not contributing to the alliance. And I know that for a lot of other countries, it makes no sense, but for French policymakers, it's real. This distinction is real. There is a last point I want to make about the shaping factors, is that NATO is a political issue in France, I think much more than in other countries. Just to give you an example, in the last round of presidential elections, so in 2017, about 46% of the French population voted for political parties which explicitly had NATO withdrawal or withdrawal from NATO as part of their program and party manifestos. If you count in the far right, the far left, several far left parties and far right parties, overall, that's 46% of the electorate. And I'm not even counting in François Fillon, who was the lead conservative candidate, because his party manifesto was not mentioning withdrawing from NATO, but everybody knows the pro-Russian tendencies that François Fillon was embodying. So there is this sense that NATO is still, I would say, open for debate in the French political discourse. And it's tied to what I think is an opposition between two very strong narratives, two strong competing narratives about what France should be in the world. There is one narrative which sees France as, you know, a universalist country of human rights because of the French Revolution and so on and so forth. And basically you have people who will probably be nicknamed Atlantists, who will recognize that if France, if values mean something to French foreign policy, then we should not be shy in terms of partnering up with other democracies, because this is what we stand up for, right? And this is part of our own history of promoting democracy and so on and so forth. And this group is, of course, much more prone in cooperating with the US, the UK, and other democracies. But you also have a different narrative, a different school, if you want, which I will call maybe geopolitical, which is about, you know, just self-serving interests, and, you know, which takes example in France's history of allying with Turkey against other Catholic countries, against the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, right? So France, a Catholic country in the 16th century. So France, a Catholic country, allying with a Muslim country against another Catholic country. Why? Because it's in our interest. And so you have this second school, which is still existing with a strong voice, powerful voices in the French debate. And they would characterize attempts at democratic cooperation as just being Western arrogance. So those two tensions, those two schools, they coexist and they compete with each other for policymakers' attention. So based on those shaping factors, I will now move on to the second part of my presentation, which will be a kind of assessment of the current situation, and that hopefully that will open it up for debate. So the first thing to take into account is that I think, just like a lot of different countries at the moment, you have contradictions within the French government between, I will call them the security services, so the MFA, the MOD, which are developing doctrines and acting in such a way that they actually recognize that Russia and China are hostiles, that we are in a phase of strategic competition, and this is translated into a number of strategic documents. But at the same time, you have business interests who are willing to engage as much as possible, because those countries, they are potential markets, right? And on top of that, you have a president who still thinks that his charisma and his charm can shift the strategic balance, especially in Europe, and contribute to appeasing relations with competitors such as Russia and China. This creates massive tensions within the bureaucracy. For example, a couple years ago, 3 years ago, when Macron announced his policy to engage with Russia at the yearly ambassadors conference, he said that I know there is a deep state in France opposing my decisions, but it will not happen. I expect you to implement my decisions. And nowadays, you'll hear a lot of French diplomats saying the president doesn't like us, the president doesn't get it, and especially because there is an entire generation of diplomats which has been scarred by their relationship with Russia in a lot of different forums, at the NATO-Russia Council, at the UN Security Council, at the OSCE. And basically they saw, or they felt, that you cannot trust Russia anymore, so engagement is pointless, but they feel that the president, A, doesn't get it, B, assumes that they are potential traitors. So it kind of creates tension within the bureaucracy. So this being said, overall, this government still is clearly pro-European, pro-democratic, and pro-transatlantic. one of the most pro-European, pro-democratic, pro-transatlantic you could find. What does it mean in terms of alliances? So I talked a lot about NATO. France considers that it's playing its part within NATO at the moment, participates in the EFP, and the current leadership has repeatedly signaled its commitment to NATO. At the same end, France is the third largest financial contributor to the alliance, participates in military operations, and so on. There is a huge frustration that comes from the collective handling or non-handling of Turkey, which is seen in Paris right now as an autocratic country turned fully autocratic, a security risk, which is underplayed and misunderstood by other allies. So this is where a lot of frustration with NATO comes from at the moment. That really comes from frustrations with Turkey. The second issue is, of course, the EU, which is always a major issue in French foreign policy. So France is always supporting initiatives that goes and help strategic autonomy, however we define it. I don't want to get into a semantic debate about it. But there is a clear division of labor in the government's mind at the moment between defense being NATO and security, which is broader than defense, having to involve the EU for things that the US does not want to do, but are still in European interests. Jihadism, migrations, whatever, you name them. Hence the task force Takuba in the Sahel, which is seen as a success by French policymakers because it shows commitment from a number of European countries to participate in the fight against jihadism. I will say that for the current government, the EU is an ideological issue in the sense that it has a very strong pro-democratic stance because the EU is about democracy. NATO is not about democracy for the government. The EU is. And this is why within the EU framework, France is really tough on Poland and Hungary, which are seen as undermining rule of law and thus undermining the potential sustainability of the EU project. At the same time, when it comes to military issues, there is an acknowledgement that there are actually very few countries that may be willing to fight when needed. And I'm going to quote them as I've heard them from a senior general a couple of weeks ago. It's the UK, Denmark, Norway, Lithuania, and Spain. All the others, there is a sense that because they rely so much on US security dependence, they may lack the will to fight when needed. And that falls back into what I was talking about earlier, that in the French view, being too dependent upon someone, you gradually lull and sleepwalks into complacency. Third aspect, because we have to talk about it, it's AUKUS. So it's been a really big deal because the French made a huge investment on Australia, and the attitude is that at least the US understand why it's a big deal in France. And the Biden-Macron discussion 2 days ago is seen as, okay, we try to mend the relationship and it's a good thing. French elites understand the Australians because, it's balancing and we can get it. There is a lot of anger towards the UK. Really, it's the UK attitude in this that is not being accepted. And it piles upon the sense that the Johnson government only wants to cheat and renege on its commitments within Brexit discussions and so on. There is another aspect. AUKUS clearly undermined and weakened the Atlantists I was talking about in the French debate because it gave a voice to those who say, see, we can never trust the US, we can never trust the Anglos, we should get along with Russia, China, and so on. And finally, I will conclude on that. All the dynamics I've been talking about in terms of being pro-European, pro-transatlantic, as much as France can be at the moment, can of course change with the next election. And you may, if you are following French politics at the moment, you know that the populist moment is not over. There is a strong autocratic tendency right now as part of the French electorate, and nowadays I absolutely cannot guarantee that Macron will be re-elected, and whomever gets elected will come from some form of hard right movement, and those are usually not very conducive towards democratic cooperation. So on that joyful note, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Olivier. So please, if you like to ask questions, there's the Q&A or Q&R box. I received already one from Jonathan Paquin. And so the question goes, where is France heading? Macron talks about a sovereign Europe, but there's no strategic consensus amongst Europeans on what to do. So what are your thoughts on that?
Macron is caught. It's a two-level game in my understanding, right? Macron is caught between the, let's say, sovereignist forces that are getting a huge voice in the French debate at the moment. So he has to give them something. And at the same time, he has this strong conviction that a stronger Europe and a degree of protection that is afforded by the size of the European market and the resilience that comes with interdependence at the regional level is the way to go, because France, like every single other European countries, has this scale problem that it's too big not to have a say in world affairs, but it's too small to be an equal partner with the US or China, right? So there is a scaling up issue that needs to be achieved. But again, two-level game, the political climate is not conducive to, no, I will not say it's not conducive. I think there is still a small majority of the French population that is fine with more European integration. It's just that you have sovereignist forces that are quite vocal at the moment, and we have entered the presidential campaign, so he has to take that into account. And also that explains why France was so harsh in the Brexit negotiations, because it was also an internal politics issue to show that if you leave the EU, there will be a cost.
Thank you. So I'll ask my own question. And again, for those in attendance, please feel free to enter a question in the chat or in the Q&A box. But I want to pick up on two separate remarks that you made over the course of your presentation. One is that France does not believe that the US security guarantee is reliable, and that a lot of France's own perspectives on alliances is informed by the historical memory of the 1930s and the 1940s. And it's true, of course, that France was seeking some sort of commitment from the United Kingdom and from the United States during the interwar period. But what's also interesting, what you left out, is that France had security guarantees to members of Poland, as well as to the Little Entente, which was made up of Romania, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. And there, the story does not end well at all, right? France did not come to their aid necessarily in 1939. Sure, they declared war, but even Gamelin, the chair of the General Staff, chief of the General Staff, he knew that France's defense commitments were just fundamentally unreliable, which brings us to the current debate, because of course, no rational-minded country should ever believe in an alliance security guarantee whatsoever, because there's always that possibility, however faint, that a defender will never come to your rescue. But the perspective, I suppose, from countries like Warsaw, which had in the past benefited directly from a security guarantee from Paris, is that, okay, it may be the case that Washington is not a reliable security guarantor in the end. That's possible, but neither is Paris for that matter. And yes, Paris may be involved in the enhanced forward presence, as you mentioned, in Estonia, but it doesn't seem like the French nuclear deterrent is tailored towards a more continental commitment. Yes, there's some language in the doctrine that suggests as much, but it's rather loose. So I was wondering if you could speak about that particular tension.
Yeah, no, I mean, you really hit it on the nail here, because what you refer to is the fundamental misunderstanding and lack of knowledge from the French elites about Central Europe, and which can lead to sometimes some very tone-deaf comments as being, lucky of the Americans and this kind of things. For the historical record, I totally agree with you, and I totally understand the perspective of Central European countries, including Poland, that have effectively been abandoned despite the security commitments that France has made. So on the historical record, I totally agree with you. I'm just saying that as part of the memories and the narratives, this aspect is totally left out of the collective understanding of what an alliance is. And it's only focused on the relationship that we have or should have with the US and the UK. Again, because in the French understanding, I mean, you know that, Alex, right? That Central European countries, we call them Eastern Europe in France, because everything that is east from Strasbourg, it's Eastern Europe, basically. So yeah, I agree with you. There is a fundamental tension. That's something that on a personal level annoys me, that I tries to communicate, but it's still deeply ingrained in this in the French security elites thinking that Central Europe doesn't matter because they will always follow the US. So we should talk to the big dog, which is the US, and Central European countries will follow suit, which ironically is exactly the way Russia behaves by misunderstanding when they engage with NATO, for example, by misunderstanding that NATO is not it's not like the Warsaw Pact, where the US dictates everything they want to do. But Russia says that they only want to engage with the US and not with the smaller countries. And France tends to do something similar. And I get why it angers people.
Thank you. So I have two questions. I'm going to ask them in turn. But do give the bat signal if you need to leave, because I know we're 8 minutes before the hour. So the first question comes from
I'll give it in 5 minutes.
Okay, so yeah, so let's move up quickly then. So the first question, and then I'll invite you to respond, is from Maxandre Fortier. How should we understand the French reaction to AUKUS? Is it simply performative? And what should we expect for the future of French-Australian cooperation?
So in my view, as I said, well, there was a lot of anger, because it was felt as a betrayal. But again, I think there is a sense that we'll get along with the US, and the US have made positive signals towards trying to mend the relationship. And we get, in the end, we get the Australian perspective, because, well, the region is polarizing alongside the pro-US, pro-China line. It's basic balancing to try to basically reinforce your alliance. So we don't like it because it's not exactly in our interest, but we understand the Australian perspective. And in the end, it will take a few months, but there is no reason to break any kind of relationship with the Australians, because Australia in any way is part of our Indo-Pacific strategy. And maybe the French mistake was probably to over-rely on defense partnerships, but it doesn't mean that other kinds of partnership with Australia will fade, and that will probably take a bit of time. But my sense is that we'll find a way to get better relations with Australia. It's not a deal breaker in terms of our commitment both to the Indo-Pacific and to Australia. Again, as I was saying, there is a lot of anger, and it's really anger towards the UK, which makes it sometimes irrational because, you know, it's emotions, right? But I've never seen that before. It's quite impressive right now in most cabinets and ministries how, yeah, the level of angriness and towards the UK.
Okay, so final question, I suppose, is from Stephanie Carvin. She's wondering if we could break down French views on alliances or working with other democratic states. There's the large geopolitical issues like subs, but then some of the technical issues like cyber, where we have seen the European Union introduce sanctions on officials for malicious activities. So is there opportunity for different approaches on different security issues? I guess I'm just interested in France's attitudes towards cyber cooperation. So if you can elaborate more on France's approach to cyber cooperation.
Okay, so as a caveat, it's really not an area I'm an expert in, so take what I say with a grain of salt. What I get from the discussions I've had on the topic is that France seems to consider the cyber domain as being so technically specific that it does not easily invite cooperation apart from cooperation on regulatory measures. If I have to put it into more academic terms, right, I will say France really believes the analysis from Ben Buchanan's in the cybersecurity dilemma, that because of the very nature of the cyber domain, if you cooperate on technical issues with other countries, well, you invite them to look at everything you're doing, and you may not want to do that. So this balance between cooperation and being totally open, France, I would say, share that analysis. So the impulse towards technical cooperation is limited, but I think there is an effort and a willingness to come up with regulatory frameworks when it comes to disinformation, for example, when it comes to ransomwares, which is a major concern. I think, like in most countries, right? Ransomwares have been so much on the rise that it has become a major policy issue. So when it comes to regulatory frameworks, I guess yes. When it comes to more technical issues, yeah, it's much more difficult. You know, it's not like you can train two platoons to interact with each other. So there is a specificity about the cyber domain in that regard. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
It's a fascinating take. Thank you very much. I know you have an engagement in 3 minutes, so I'll let you get on your way. But again, on behalf of everyone, my thanks for your participation and for sweeping away various misconceptions or myths about France's own approach to alliance politics. I really am grateful for that. So now we'll switch on to more regular programming. We're going to have Dominika Kunertova and Andrew Dorman do their tandem. So Dominika, are you available?
I'm right here.
Perfect. All right, great seeing you. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Well, good afternoon, morning from Eastern Europe, I think, Zurich, right? East to South Strasbourg. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this workshop. I'm really happy that it's finally happening, although only on Zoom. So thank you, Jonathan, again. I prepared a PowerPoint, so I'm gonna just try to share my screen as a courtesy to interpreters. Yeah, right. Share and up. Can you see it? Yeah.
I can see it.
Great.
Presumably everyone else can see it.
Okay, sorry, it's just
yeah, we see it.
We can see it. It's just we can see the entire PowerPoint interface. So maybe you want to go to full screen mode.
Yes, that's what I was trying to do, and it's okay. Great. So I won't say my notes. Good.
Voila,
Voila. So in my presentation, I'm gonna look at the more general picture about where Europe fits in this shifting world, as the title of this conference puts it. And I will talk about my favorite topic, which is transatlantic relations. And since I work at the think tank, I'm a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies. There's a lot of prescriptive dimension because I like to tell people what to do, right? So this is my presentation. So I will first talk about a little bit of Europe's current security anxieties, and then I will address strategic autonomy. Yes, I will go into the semantic discussion in contrast to Olivier. Then I will address the new challenge that China is posing, and then I will outline what I think it would be great that Europe would come up with vis-a-vis the US. First, right, the whole conundrum of what these recent developments that made Europeans nervous. Well, first of all, I believe it's the slow disappearance of arms control and confidence building measures, especially after the death of INF treaty. And then recently Russia also withdrew from the open skies. So which is making the whole security environment in Europe very much unpredictable and uncertain. We already heard about AUKUS. This comes to the picture of how certain European leaders started again pondering the fact that US is disengaging from European security affairs. And that was basically the whole Trump presidency. And people thought okay, with Biden, there's some kind of a European US president, right? And Biden was really heartwarming about strengthening NATO and the alliance between US and Europe, right? But then we saw conclusion of this AUKUS deal, then the hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan, which kind of fed into the picture of US being an unreliable partner. So these recent developments basically made this concept of strategic autonomy make the headlines again, because it is not a new concept, right? So in my presentation, I'm asking what this ambition for strategic autonomy means in the context of resurgent great power rivalry and the US being preoccupied by China. So I would like to argue that this Sino-American rivalry is actually a good opportunity to advance Europe's strategic autonomy ambitions. But at the same time, the Europeans need to proceed with caution, and that this dynamic developments are basically good opportunity to strengthen the transatlantic partnership, even though it sounds counterintuitive. So I noticed that over the course of this year, there has been heated debates about how well European countries are actually equipped to defend themselves. If they're talking about strategic autonomy, what is it that they can do in face of Russian aggression, right? And most of the scholars agreed that even though there is a lot of manpower and the spending is more or less okay, but the European capabilities are obsolete, inefficient, there's lack of coordination, it's fragmented on the market, and that there's still a lot of critical equipment that is missing, especially military satellites or air and missile defense systems. So the answer depends on how you set the parameters of the scenario if the US is really out of the picture when it comes to providing European security. So in these debates kind of inspired me to look at the basic elements of strategy, like aligning means and ways into some political means, right? And I could see that there are persisting problems in all three categories. So when it comes to those means, well, it's a basic fact that Europe is not one defense market. It's fractured by national borders. And just as illustration, I work also on military technology in terms of drones. And even though there's an appetite for multilateral cooperation, just developing this current generation drones is still ongoing since 2013. So it's one way to one thing to wish for greater cooperation and having economy of scales, but at the same time there is also industrial nationalism going on. Which prevents efficient development of capabilities that Europeans would need. In terms of ways, well, it's one, again, you can have your capabilities, but if there are no means to actually, the ways to mobilize and use them, it's a problem. This brings me to the question of how well European Union members can capitalize on the NATO command and control structures, because that needs to take into account the fact that the NATO non-EU and EU non-NATO members need to abstain if some cooperation needs to happen. So then for the end, that's the whole strategic dissonance that demonstrates the fact that security and defense is very much an intergovernmental policy. And it's in the hands of national governments that it's natural that their prioritization of threats is not aligned all the time. Like Russia is way bigger threat for Central and Eastern European countries than in France or Italy. But what I actually missed a lot in this renewed debate on strategic autonomy is the nuclear shadow. Is one because it's inconceivable for the next 2-3 decades to actually have a European strategic autonomy that would also contain the ultimate strategic weapon, which is nukes. So here, in the sense that most European countries are very happy to develop their own industrial and operational autonomy, but when it comes to the fact that as long as European countries are facing nuclear-armed Russia, US is not answer a question, and it's not an optional relationship. So this is basically a main early warning that if the European countries want to proceed with their strategic autonomy ambition, they need to do it with caution. And here, so what the strategic autonomy means, as Olivier hinted, that it's semantically really confusing, but I would look at it in a way that this debate actually very well illustrates the divergences in strategic thinking of European countries. If we look at this strategic autonomy in the scope of defense and security, because there's also especially representatives of EU institutions that they enlarge the scope and they talk about autonomy in trade or energy. But for us as experts in security and defense, it's really this area that is pertinent to talk about today. So for this strategic autonomy in defense and security, it's like the French level, the ultimate sovereignty, and then there are then there is the split with the Germans that are more vocal about underlining the importance of transatlantic partnership with the US and the US nuclear umbrella. And then there are Central and Eastern European countries that are really apprehensive about any discussion that would put the US partnership into question, clearly because of Russia. But most of the countries in Europe don't see a contradiction between improving European capabilities and the technological industrial base at the same time as reinforcing relationship with the US. So that's a discussion about the concept of strategic autonomy that illustrates that Europe cannot speak with unisono. And the other thing is the NATO-EU conundrum. So on the EU side, I just couldn't resist to put a NATO flag here, because in the EU there's this whole strategic dialogue going on that is termed strategic compass. It's a member states-led process in which they like to kind of create and shape a common European strategic culture along these four themes. And I just couldn't help to mention that strategic compass is something that NATO allies thought about at the very beginning and put that into their flag. This fact that the high level of institutionalization of security and defense cooperation among European countries can also impede the ambition to improve European capabilities. Right. So, but as it was also mentioned, that EU is more broad security actor, and its role it's not to counter Russian tanks or hypersonic missiles. That's on the institutional level. Now let me move to the question of China. I know these slides are a little bit busy, but I really thought about the interpreters. So for China, the main problem is that there's no agreement, what kind of threat China poses to European security. And most countries are conceptualizing their relations on three levels. First of all, that China is a partner, and it needs to be taken into the big picture if the global agenda is on the table, like climate change and environmental protection. Increasingly, China is portrayed as a competitor in terms of technological leadership standards or governance of the internet, or competing for markets in third countries. So here I would also mention that this is an important domain in the sense of the volume, because China is the main trading partner to European Union, and European Union is the biggest market for China. So, and the third conceptualization of China is rivalry, and this is where European values clashes with the Chinese one, which is human rights, political freedoms, data protection. Here, for most years, it would be fair to say that European countries were kind of naive about China as a trade partner, and they were docile with their investments. But the tide has been changing recently. But what I like to mention is that European countries are realizing that China does pose a security threat, and not in the military terms. That place is still attributed to Russia, but it's in the sense that there's relying on the US for security and on China for prosperity is no longer sustainable. And of course, it will come with a cost to position clearly in this great power hostile dynamics. But there's no time for some strategic equidistance, as was put by the German leaders, and any kind of ambiguity. So I don't know how much time I have. So for my conclusion here would be that, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that the rise of China and its rising assertiveness is actually a good opportunity for European countries and the US to strengthen their transatlantic bargain by adding this Chinese layer. This means that as a pragmatic realization that the US is prioritizing Asia-Pacific, this is a good opportunity for European countries to actually improve their defense capabilities without alienating anyone like with a strong pro-Atlantist feelings. So that's especially when it comes to improving the conventional force readiness. At the same time, do it with caution, because the European countries still need a US nuclear umbrella, because neither NATO nor the EU are good institutional frameworks for some kind of Europeanized nuclear capability. And then, as the Chinese layer, that's not only to please the US so that they could like keep US engaged in European affairs, but out of own European security interest, that European countries are not able to keep the Chinese influence at bay on their own, and it would be great if they could coalesce and cooperate with the US in terms of technology and trade. For instance, preventing European technology enabling Chinese military modernization. So that's really most of my points are based on pragmatic fact checking. Yeah, that's what I say. So to conclude my presentation and my thinking about where Europe stands in this great power shift is that again, it's a good opportunity for Europeans to advance and move forward with their healthy military emancipation, but also under the realization that only industrial and operational autonomy is not enough, and as long as they're facing nuclear armed adversary. This means that if they're talking about autonomy, it's better to talk about autonomy to do something, to act, rather than autonomy from US, for instance. So not to antagonize and define their ambition in negative terms, let's say. And so this means that the European strategic autonomy within this limit, within this scope, would mean that Europeans need to build their defense capabilities as their priority, and then coordinate the approach to China with the US. So yeah, I look forward to your questions. I forgot to mention a lot of things, so maybe I will pop up in the discussion. Thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now. Stop share.
All right. So, all right. I no longer see your screen, so I presume that everyone else cannot see it. So, thank you very much. Now, Andrew Dorman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope that we have share screen. There we are. It's coming to come up.
I cannot yet see it, but I'll let you know when
there we are.
All right, it's starting. I can see the PowerPoint.
Yep. I've just got to get it to go that way. Okay. How's that? Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for inviting me for this conference and chance to talk about the United Kingdom. And listening to Olivier's piece to start with, it reminds me so much about the United Kingdom. France and the United Kingdom have a very difficult and interesting relationship. They are so similar, yet so very different. So a lot of the criticisms and arguments that Olivier was putting about how the French were feeling and so forth, I just saw mirror images on the UK side and the other side of the channel. But if it's worth, when we think about alliances and where the UK fits into all this, I think the very first thing I would emphasize is there's a very different between what has been, since the UK establishment, what traditional British foreign security policy has been about, its defence policy relationships, and what the current administration led by Boris Johnson has been. So if we start off, in a sense, with the long-term traditional views of British defence and security policy and so forth, I think it's worth bearing in mind that UK foreign policy has been incredibly consistent for centuries in many respects. And it has 4 basic lines in there. The first line is to keep the Union, the 4 nations that comprise the United Kingdom, together in some form. And obviously with the issues, particularly over where Scotland fits within the Union, there's tensions there. But ultimately, the ultimate security threat to the United Kingdom is about the Union. So preservation of the Union is absolutely key. And this has become a much more important issue over the last few years. The second has been the United Kingdom has always been a trading nation. As a relatively small, densely packed, in terms of population, our country, the United Kingdom needs to trade. It produces about 40 to 50% of its food to feed its population. It has to trade. It has to import food. It has to import raw materials. It has to import oil and gas now to help sustain it and keep it going. So it's a trading nation, and we've seen that for centuries. And as a result of that, the key things for the United Kingdom have been, firstly, that Europe remains stable or peaceful in some form. So the United Kingdom can trade both with Europe and trade beyond Europe. So the United Kingdom's position has always been that it does not want a single state or group of states to dominate Europe, that it's always, we're very happy when there's been a balance of power there. In a sense, if we used modern day international relations theory and language there, we'd say the United Kingdom's seen its role as an offshore balancer. And historically, that has always been the case up until the end of the Second World War, that the UK has seen itself as a way as a balancing power within Europe to ensure that Europe remains peaceful. And despite what the Johnson administration at the moment is dealing with, the UK has very much emphasised a rules-based order because it's wanted to trade. To trade, it wanted freedom of navigation for seas and so forth. Rules and the rules-based order has very much suited it. And if you wanted to sum up the United Kingdom at the moment, and it has been for the last 50 or so years, in many respects, it's a stasis power. It's a power which was the first industrial nation. It was the leading nation before the United States took over from it. And it's been in relative decline for more than a century now, as other states have gone past it. It's still a significant economic power. It's still a significant power in terms of influence in the likes of NATO, the European Union, of the United Nations as a permanent member and so forth. It has disproportionate influence compared to a small country of just over 60 million people. And from a UK point of view, the best thing that can happen is things do not change because it has disproportionate influence and disproportionate power. So one of the problems the UK has got in terms of identifying its travel, its direction of travel, is it can see that basically it is relative decline. Not overall decline, but it's relative decline. And basically it wants to put that off for as long as possible. So basically it doesn't want other powers to rise. It doesn't want its position to be relatively undermined. And therefore the logical position for it is everything should stay as it is. But within that, there are a number of problems, going back to that slide before. In terms of the problems within that, there is an identity problem of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom cannot actually identify who it is. What it considers itself to be is incredibly difficult. It's been a country of significant immigration and emigration. So there is not a identity of what is a Britain, what it constitutes Britain. You know, the 4 nations have different political relationships, different ideological relationships with one another. There is no sort of uniform view of what constitutes being British, apart from some idea of values. The second issue we see within the United Kingdom is that that there is a significant colonial legacy. And you see that in a lot of the language, in terms of its positioning, in terms of how it deals with, and a lot of colonial baggage it has not got over. That classic line from Dulles of the 60s of, Britain has lost an empire but not yet found a role. It has elements of truth. It has found a role, but it has not got over the idea that it is no longer that number one power. And you see, bringing it forward to some of the arguments that you're seeing in the integrated review and coming out of the Johnson administration of Global Britain, is about some return to an ideal vision of what the 1950s or early were, where Britain's voice was heard. The other dimension to bear in mind, and this links in very much with one thing that Olivier was talking about, that Britain also took from the Battle of France in 1940 and the fall of France. And like the French, I think both the United Kingdom and France took from that no state will ultimately commit suicide for another. So when the British government promised more fighter squadrons and resources to France, actually it didn't send them. That ultimately it was recognised that France and the fort was going to fall, and the only way to carry on the fight against fascism was to abandon France. And the ignominy of Dunkirk and so forth are partly a reflection that ultimately no state will commit suicide for another, which means that the central heart of all British defence policy has been the creation and maintenance of a nuclear deterrent. Initially, it was about deterring the Soviet Union as the dominant land power in Europe, and tying the Americans in to deter the Soviet. But ultimately, if you cannot ultimately trust the Americans because of this, the ultimate way for the United Kingdom to deter anyone in Europe is to have its own nuclear capability. So you've seen the development of nuclear capability. The UK was the third nuclear power. But it's interesting, part of that legacy. I mean, there are three reasons why the UK does it. Partly it's about security, it's about deterrence. There's a second, that its nuclear capabilities were, from the start, were seen as part of a symbol of Britain's greatness. The 1948 Defence White Paper talked about Britain being not a superpower, but a world power. World powers had nuclear capability. So it's about symbolising Britain's relative greatness. Sometimes put in the language of, could a British Prime Minister talk to a French president if we didn't have nuclear weapons? Because they would have nuclear weapons, we wouldn't. You know, we have to be of the same standing. So it's about standing, the status, and where they fit into all this. And there's all, you know, and if we look at some of the feminist literature on this, would argue it's also an element of a virility symbol. About, you know, it is about Britain's greatness, but it's also about just trying to hang on there and so forth. So going on to the second slide, at the heart of British defence and security policy has always been a system of alliances and a web of alliances. But the key alliance since the end of the Second World War has been Britain's relationship with the United States. As the United States replaced the UK as Europe's offshore balancer, and the UK committed forces permanently to the defence of Europe, you know, the creation of NATO was about tying in the Americans to the defence of Europe. So the US relationship has been absolutely key for the United Kingdom. It's both a nuclear relationship, it's an intelligence relationship, it's a security relationship, but also much underplayed, but also needs to be recognised. It's an economic relationship. The interplay between the City of London, the financial institutions there, and New York are absolutely central. So it's a very close relationship, but it's also an inherently personal relationship between President and Prime Minister. And one of the problems the United Kingdom has had for more than a decade now is a succession of prime ministers and presidents who have not got on with each other. Not since the Blair-Bush relationship have we seen a succession of British prime ministers who have not wanted to be seen to be too needy on the American relationship, but also trying to work that relationship. And we've had a whole series of difficult relationships. And the relationship between Boris Johnson and Joe Biden is no different from that. They don't get on. Biden doesn't rate Johnson, and Johnson's not very good at developing personal relationships with other world leaders and so forth. So there's a difficult relationship there, but the US relationship remains central. We've also seen, as I said, the UK is focused on a whole series of other alliances with NATO at its core, but there's a whole series of other alliances. So we've got things like the firepower defence agreement arrangements in the Pacific with Australia, New Zealand, guaranteeing the protection of Singapore and Malaysia. There are others, the Nordic group and so forth. Britain has always had a whole series of multifaceted relationships and partnerships. But I think the one that I think is worth bearing in mind is more recently, is over the last 25 years or so, that Britain has had a wave of different second partners. It's talked about in 98, we had the St. Malo agreements going on with France, and talk about France being Britain's second special relationship. By 2003, with the Iraq War and experience in Afghanistan, Britain was now talking about Australia as being the second special relationship. Moving on to 2010, there was with the Lancaster declarations and so forth, real accord and developments back to the relationship with France. The Anglo-French relationship was central, and some of the nuclear side were brought closer together. Bringing it up to 21 with the disintegrated review, or the integrated review as it's officially known, Australia is back on the cards, and you see this with the new partnership on nuclear side with Australia and the US. Australia is now often referred to as the second partner. So what we've seen is Britain flitting and having fads between who is its second special partner. But there are a whole series of alliances out there, and the one thing we can guarantee is it will continue to change. So I think if we think about how it works in these relationships, those fads, we've got Britain trying to, where did it fit today? I mean, if you want to look at the official documentation, the UK had an official integrated review and a defence white paper that produced in the spring of this year, came out in March. I think it's worth stepping back first to think about it, that what you have with the Johnson administration is a very different type of government and administration to a lot of its predecessors. Johnson doesn't abide by rules. The UK historically has always abided by the rules. We have a fixation with rules, and everyone else, fixation when the UK was part of the European Union and everybody else breaking the rules. We want to emphasise that everyone should adhere to the rules. Johnson and his administration don't see themselves bound by the rules, so they're having a sense agreed, leave an agreement with the rest of the European Union. They don't feel hidebound by the accord agreed over Northern Ireland and its borders with the Republic of Ireland, and that's difficult for them. Johnson, in many respects, is like Trump was. He's transactional. He doesn't feel hidebound by previous agreements. He doesn't feel hidebound by previous statements or what we might refer to as the truth in the past. And those around him are very ideologically switched and akin to him, very much within the Brexiteer camp. And we've had a succession of really weak foreign secretaries within that. Within the integrated review, Johnson's background is as a classicist. He did classics at when he was at Oxford, and he brought in some classic historians to come give him advice about where Britain should fit. And what we've got is an element of return to what Churchill's three circles idea of Britain's relationship with Europe, its relationship with the United States, and its relationship with the Commonwealth, and how it pivots amongst those. This is the three circles. Literature has been significantly critiqued and dismissed for the last 20 years or so. But what you've got is an administration that is strategically illiterate, not very well aware of its history, and it's harking back to where it perceives the UK used to be. So one of the things you've seen within the integrated view is an element of a pivot, a refocus on Britain's global world, and it comes within this language of global Britain. And it's worth bearing in mind that global Britain as a strapline came from Theresa May, Johnson's predecessor, but there's been never any detail put onto it. It was a classic line about Britain's global world, but nobody knew what it really meant. Britain's position in the world, but no detail came out. A bit has come out with this integrated review. If you read the document, it is appallingly written. It really has been poorly put together. So there's a lot of things that are, there's lots of repetition, other bits that are omitted. So it has been a poorly edited and put together document where it doesn't really hang very well. Like the previous speaker, looking at Europe more widely, it talks about Britain's, as China as both a strategic threat, but also as an economic partner. But having looked at the Australian experiences, I think a recognition now that actually this just doesn't work. Having seen how it worked for Australia, and increasingly there's tension with China, particularly over China's relationship with Hong Kong and how that agreement was put through. There was, with the creation of the Australia alliance with the UK, but the French are rightly angry at the British. It was very ineptly handled. I don't think what we see with the British administration is they just didn't get, Johnson didn't get it, didn't realise it would be a big thing. He's emphasised British industrial base, defence industrial base, and sees that as a way forward. But what he didn't do was to reach out to Macron and to deal with and explain the relationship and where it's gone. He's not sensed to pour oil and troubled waters there. So what we've seen is a real problems with the Anglo-French relationship at a difficult time, which shouldn't have been there. And this is part of the general inept handling of the current administration. So where does he go from here? In terms of defence, the UK has talked about and pledged to do a lot more on the defence side, but it's not affordable. The reality is when you look at the UK defence budget and what it wants to do, there's problems there. The assumptions coming out of Brexit with a lot of the security agreements would not need to be renegotiated with the rest of the European Union, that it would be in everybody's interest for them just to carry on. But now things like Britain being sort of pulled out of Galileo means it has to develop its own satellite system. So there's a whole series of things that it's now having to commit itself to that it simply cannot afford. It's not clear whether the UK is going to focus on NATO as a global player or as a European player. It sees both Russia and China as both as threats. Stepping back, the more established view would be to focus on Russia and to agree China that they're both threats. The UK, if it wanted to, could do one of the things with regards to Russia is to free ride, to actually hand the rest of the Russian problem over to the rest of NATO and say, you know, we can step back from this. We provide the second nuclear guarantee within NATO. We could step back from this. It's not quite clear if that is where Johnson's headed or not, partly because it's just not clear where Johnson's headed. Because what you see with a lot of government policy in defence and security is one of those. It's a whole series of sort of lily pads of little lines that have come out, but with no sort of intricate links between them. What this means long-term will depend on how long Johnson survives in government and who succeeds him, and whether that is a return to a more establishment viewpoint or whether it's going to carry on those lines. And with that bearing in mind time, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you both for those very uplifting talks. So I have questions for both of you, but I care more about the audience. So I'm going to start taking questions from members of the audience. I already have one, again, from Jonathan Paquin. But for the rest of you, please, you can send me a line directly, or you can simply enter your question in either French or in English in the Q&A or Q&R, and I'll ask the question. But this is a question that I've been asking, so I'm happy that Jonathan has raised it, and it's for Andrew. So what does the United Kingdom make of Canada? You've mentioned France and Australia as second partners, but why is it that the United Kingdom and Canada are not more strategically aligned?
Thank you. Great question. I think, if I'm going to be honest with this, I think that there's an element to which the two administrations, both Canadian and the British administration, haven't reached out to each other. I think they actually are more strategically aligned. And it's interesting when you think of some of the industrial side, you've got the Type 26 program, which the Canadians have embraced and taken on board. And when it comes to NATO, when it comes to the Pacific, actually, I think the UK and Canada's interests are far more aligned than they actually are being portrayed. I think the Australia-UK-US relationship treaty was announced during Canadian elections. So I think if it had been announced at a different time, I think there would have been a hope to have heard a Canadian voice in there. But as we know, with any democratic government, the last thing you want is something controversial during an election period. So I suspect, I have no expertise on Canadian domestic politics, but I would suspect if I'd been a Canadian Prime Minister at the time, that's the last thing I would want to engage in the midst of a domestic election campaign. And I think it's interesting. I think the UK very much emphasised, and the Johnson administration in some respects also talks about the Five Eyes agreement. And I think the two that were silent in this deal were partly Canada, and I think that was probably for domestic reasons at the time. And New Zealand was not vocal in that one because it was about nuclear issues at the time. And the last thing that I think Five Eyes wanted to do was to re-emphasise the nuclear dimension when it comes to New Zealand, because since New Zealand came back into Five Eyes post the Ferrara during the 1980s, and there's no desire to upset New Zealanders, and they don't need to go each and talk about nuclear submarines. But beyond on the technology side, and the other elements of this agreement, I think Canada and New Zealand would be far more involved.
Yeah, I would just add that even with respect to Ukraine, Canada and the United Kingdom have done quite a bit of more or less the same things. They have been training tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers through operations Unifier and Orbital, respectively. So there's a lot of congruence. We just don't see anything official, anything very public on that score. I have a question for Dominika as I wait other questions from other members of the audience. So you mentioned that reliance on the United States for security and relying on the United States for security and relying on China for prosperity is unsustainable. And I suppose that reminds me a little bit of South Korea's own situation, because after all, it's more or less in the same conundrum. And I was wondering, to what extent is that really unsustainable? And secondly, what will have to give? If it is unsustainable, like how do we see the end game unfold?
Thanks for this great question. Yeah, it has like a lot of sub questions and less answers, of course. Well, unsustainable, that's also, of course, it's not only Europe that is in this position, but it's unsustainable in a way that, as I mentioned in my presentation, that China is not a benign trade partner. And despite the fact that the EU and China are like respectively their biggest markets, the Europeans already start to like implementing the investment screening measures, making sure that they double check and that their critical infrastructure is protected, and it's in a sense that there are increasing number of areas where European values and standards conflict with the Chinese ones. So this is and this will be only growing, these divergences. So where this all leads is that unfortunately European countries need to like realize that it will have some economic costs. This decrease of reliance on the Chinese asset, Chinese trade relations. That's my main take on that. That it will have some cost. So, sorry. That's I know. For instance, I really like that EU and the US established this technology tech council, where they're gonna like coordinate their approach to their policies in tech domain. And I don't know, like just one idea that comes to my mind. Recently there was this scam purchase by a Chinese company of one Italian manufacturer of really like high-tech drones, and that was like a Chinese way of inserting themselves on the market, but at the same time doing their industrial espionage. So that's on the level of technology, but also we've been seeing information about how the Chinese Communist Party is establishing branches outside the Chinese territory when it comes to student unions, Chinese state-owned companies, but also increasingly private companies. So this kind of like reminds me of this opportunity for European countries that had experience with life under totalitarian regime, like how they can mobilize their experience in rebuffing these totalitarian tendencies of a country that is an important trade partner. So it would require a lot of like innovative thinking about striking the right balance between economic gains, but also protecting the European way of living. So yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. So I have another question from Maxence Fortier, and this is for Andrew. How sustainable is the military spending announced in the integrated review? Is there a risk that the government will have to abandon some programs for fiscal reasons, not least because of COVID-19 and so forth?
Great question. Even without COVID-19 and even without Brexit, the program was not sustainable. The reality is that if we go back to the 2015 National Security Strategy and Strategic Defence and Security Review, it premised a whole series of program uplifts based on money that didn't really exist, based on efficiency savings and the sale of defence bases and so forth. This has not proven to be salvageable, so that was unaffordable. When we had the uplift in defence with the integrated review and so forth, that uplift of money was all for new equipment, further equipment. They haven't resolved how to pay for their existing program, let alone any of the new equipment. So it's not sustainable, and they've got a number of programs that are in severe trouble. Probably the most obvious one is the current armored reconnaissance vehicle program, which is basically just not working. And they're trying to work out how on earth they're going to do a solution to this one. So what we're going to see, I would suggest in the next few months is, next few years, is a series of programs. What they'll do what they normally do, which is they'll push programs to the right. So they'll delay and obfuscate and try and delay cancellations, but a number of cancellations will be needed. And if you go back to the whole idea of UK pivot to Asia Pacific, then it starts to unpick a lot of the arguments for quite a significant part of the army. So I think watch this space. There will be cuts. Thank you.
Thanks. So I have another question from Jonathan Paquin, and it's for Dominika. So you mentioned that most European countries do not see a contradiction between more European military capabilities and maintaining good transatlantic relations as long as Europe does not question too much the connection with the United States. So in your view, what would happen if France were to push harder for strategic autonomy and distancing from the United States?
Thanks. Well, I believe that already happened to a certain extent because Jesus, I have like the notion of time is kicking me, but it was like this year or last year, Macron had a speech at the Sorbonne, I think, and it was kind of like putting this idea on the table of the Europeanized nuclear capability, and it was met with either silence or like hesitant reactions. But because the thing is that again, within the European Union, there are countries that signed the nuclear ban treaty, and their position is really neutral. So they can't support any changes when it comes to nuclear policy. So the provision under NATO is really convenient, let's say, for them, that these questions are confined to this alliance. The question was then, what would happen if Macron or like France would push harder? Well, that's what I say. Like it's Austria, Ireland, these countries would block the policy on the EU level, that's for sure. Because, as I said, this defense policy is intergovernmental. It's the way out of here would be to step up the arms control policies on the EU level. That's the way around it. But at the same time, there's also reluctance to host more US nuclear weapons. So it's, and the general feeling is that the European countries would be very reluctant to be caught in the middle of the great power competition again. So this is the status. like out of all this rambling, it's just the status quo that is feasible at the moment, right? Yeah, I don't know, like the European position towards the French discourse on nuclear weapons is really like flat-footed, and that's there's also like the illustration, like what was the reaction to the AUKUS incident. Like there were no like vocal support or like sympathy expressed to France out of fear that that would like alienate the US a little bit. So that's my take on the general feeling right now. Yeah.
Thanks. It's a tough question. I'm not sure how even I would answer it. I have a question for Andrew, and it sort of picks up on AUKUS, which Dominika just mentioned. So obviously, in those official documents that you mentioned, there's a greater emphasis on the Indo-Pacific, not necessarily to supplant the importance of European security, but certainly much more emphasis. I forget the word, it was like a rebalance, but there was a specific word to highlight that added emphasis. And then of course, AUKUS means greater defense cooperation, especially with respect to not just submarines, but also to emerging technologies like cyber, quantum computing, and so forth. Now, I do realize you mentioned that Johnson is not one to stick to the rules or to maintain commitments. So maybe this is a silly question, but given everything that I just said, is there any prospect of a formal security guarantee or a formal alliance with Australia? Could it join, let's say, even ANZUS? Or is that just something that Britain will not do? It's happy with what's doing already. I've seen articles that have appeared as of late calling for London to extend some sort of formal guarantee. And in the spirit of this very conference, it seems like the question is pertinent. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts.
No, great question. I don't think there's been seen to be a need to formally provide a treaty or an alliance partnership with Australia. I think one of the things you've seen the UK doing along, like the Americans, is to very much push that for a global NATO. So, and you've seen the UK pushing for its relationships both with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. And I think one of the things I've seen is, in a sense, an element of which the NATO guarantee is, it becomes a global guarantee, that actually NATO needs to become, it becomes, in a sense, the world alliance for the West and so forth. So I think that's where they've been driving on that. In de facto terms, I think both Australia and New Zealand have a security guarantee. There is, if something were to happen, that there is a de facto guarantee coming from the United Kingdom. What level of support they could actually give compared to what they would get from the US guarantee is completely is another thing. And I think that's why you get the relationship, particularly with both those countries and the United States. But also, I think one of the reasons why the UK has emphasised the five-power defence agreement with Singapore and Malaysia is also, and its close relationship also with Brunei, is elements to which it's got very strong partnerships with countries that are between Australia and New Zealand and China. So in a sense, if there was to be something, a threat to China, or sorry, Australia or to New Zealand, there'll be a threat to other states, of which the UK has already guaranteed beforehand. So I haven't spoken to officials, but I'm assuming that they don't see a need to guarantee per se. But I think one of the things you will start to see is much more integration of potentially Australian and UK forces. One of the things coming out of this latest alliance is whether the UK deploys one of its nuclear submarines to and shares it with Australia. Is one of the options, a way of training Australian submariners in nuclear technology and so forth. So one of the things you might start to see is some sharing of assets and so forth. And it's interesting, one of the things, more recent acquisitions, which is going through, is in replacing the airborne early warning capabilities, the UK chose the same system as the Australians had to ensure compatibility. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm mindful of the time because we have to finish this session no later than 11:59. But I do have one last question from Maxence Fortier that I would like to ask, and it's for Dominika. So he asked, how should we understand the recent engagement of certain Eastern European countries with Taiwan and the subsequent rise in tensions between them and China? The case of Lithuania comes to mind. Lithuania has been fairly vocal in support for Taiwan, as you know, and China has retaliated. So is an alignment of sorts that we're seeing between them and China? Is it an alignment on the US position, or is it based on shared experiences of dealing with giant totalitarian neighbors?
I would say that it was like a sober realization, because what comes to my mind with this question is the 17+1 format. That was those 17 Central European countries that like kind of created this format on the Chinese government's initiative to have like a close trade and investment relations. And Lithuania was the first country that left this format because of some diplomatic argument and the expulsion of ambassadors. And my interpretation of this is that the growing disillusionment less of rosy. Jesus, it's a like the countries participating in this format, which is outside the EU, of course. That they were disappointed by the volume of investment and like from the Chinese government, and it's I don't believe it's position based on their experience of dealing with the totalitarian neighbors. It's more pragmatic and transactional. But on the footnote, I would also mention that, for instance, that no European country went rogue on China, that would like sideline with China and left like the Western kind of orientation, even in case of Hungary, because the Hungarian alignment with China, okay, it can be an admiration of Orban for the Chinese government, but it's mostly in like out of spite to you know, like create some tension in the EU and show like how they are not happy with the bureaucracy there, whatever. So that's yeah, the 17+1 format here. Thanks.
Okay, so I actually got one last question, I suppose, again, and this is coming from Stephanie Carvin, and she asks, or she says, so Boris Johnson floated the idea of a D10. I suppose D means democracy. To what extent was that a sincere idea held by the United Kingdom government at the time, or was that just one of a variety of alliances that seems to have been floated by the Johnson government?
Great question. I think that there was a tension. There's an obvious logic for the UK to develop a D10 or an alliance of democracies and so forth, or re-establish what we might call the West, or something along those lines. So there was an inherent strategic logic to it. But I think with so much of what we see with Boris Johnson's government is it's very difficult to interpret, because he comes up with an idea, and then it's very little interpretation, implementation, or things like that. It's whims and fads. So I think what we saw with that one is he floated it and went away, and he's probably forgotten about it. It'll be for others to try and push it through, I think, to be honest. And I don't think it will probably go anywhere unless somebody else starts to take it and drive it through. But I suspect the Biden administration might well do that, in which case he'll just follow along. Thank you.
Fair enough. All right. So I think that's it for this session. Thank you everyone for keeping to the time, and thank you also for the questions. So in about 2 or so minutes, we have Brigadier-General Richard Giguère giving his keynote for this particular conference. So please stay tuned. And again, thank you everyone. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Thanks to all of you, Andrew and Dominika. Great work. Thanks again. Hopefully we'll see each other in person next time.
That would be great. Thank you.
All right.
Absolutely. Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you so much.
All right. So it's 11:59. I guess we can move on to our keynote address. Let me introduce you Brigadier-General Richard Giguère. Our discussion will be in French, so do not hesitate to click on the button of your screen if you want to have an English translation. Bonjour Richard Giguère, c'est un plaisir de vous accueillir à ce colloque international sur la coopération de défense entre alliés. Je rappelle que vous êtes professeur invité à l'Université Laval et que vous spécialisez sur les enjeux qui sont reliés à la défense et puis à la sécurité. Il y a beaucoup de choses à dire sur votre parcours parce que vous cumulez plus de 35 ans d'expérience au sein de l'armée canadienne. Vous avez fait carrière dans l'infanterie au sein du Royal 22e Régiment. Et puis, vous avez été en poste à l'étranger au sein de plusieurs missions. Vous avez été en Allemagne, vous avez été en Haïti, à Kaboul et puis aussi à Kandahar. Vous avez aussi exercé des fonctions diplomatiques au cours de votre carrière, puisque vous avez été notamment en fonction à Washington comme attaché militaire à notre ambassade. Vous avez dirigé le Collège des forces canadiennes de Toronto, dont la mission est de préparer les hauts dirigeants militaires et civils, à la fois des étudiants qui sont canadiens, mais aussi des étudiants étrangers. Donc, vous avez une riche expérience. Je termine peut-être en disant que vous vous êtes breveté de l'École de guerre de Paris et que vous avez complété une formation au niveau opérationnel à la Joint and Combined Warfighting School de Norfolk en Virginie. Donc, sur ce, Brigadier-Général Giguère, d'abord, bienvenue. Merci d'être là.
Merci. Merci beaucoup, professeur Paquin. Je vous remercie énormément là, de cette invitation. Pour moi, c'est un grand privilège d'être en fait dans le même forum que des experts là, de la trempe, que ceux qui sont avec nous. Je remarque aussi dans la liste des participants des anciens élèves, Pierre Colotti, Pierre Rémi Carugati. Alors, bienvenue à vous aussi. Bien content de voir que d'anciens élèves sont toujours de la partie. Comme vous avez mentionné, on va poursuivre notre entretien en français. But I would be more than happy to entertain any questions in English, if any, of course. If you don't mind my accent from Saguenay, Lac-Saint-Jean, or is it the Washingtonian accent? I don't know. It's one of the other. Alors encore une fois, un grand merci et puis je vous félicite pour ce colloque, ce forum qui est extrêmement important, qui arrive à une période très mouvementée dans les relations internationales. Alors donc, je peux y aller avec quelques commentaires au professeur Paquin. Je vais attendre vos questions.
Oui, vous allez nous parler aujourd'hui de la notion de surprise comme principe de guerre. J'ai bien hâte de vous entendre nous parler de cette notion-là parce que en tant que militaire, c'est ce que vous avez fait tout au long de votre carrière. Je comprends que c'est une donnée qui est toujours très importante à prendre en compte dans les calculs. Mais pourriez-vous d'abord définir ce que vous entendez par là, par la surprise? Et puis, en quoi est-ce que cette notion-là est importante dans le cadre des discussions que nous avons aujourd'hui sur donc la coopération entre démocraties dans le domaine de la défense?
Écoutez, il y avait, quand on m'a demandé le titre de mon intervention et que j'ai dit la surprise est un principe de guerre, 3 petits points, il y avait un peu de sarcasme là-dedans parce que, vous savez, il existe des principes de guerre depuis des temps immémoriaux. Je révisais d'ailleurs ce matin un petit livre qui avait été publié en 1948 par la défense canadienne de l'époque qui parlait des principes de guerre que je consultais quand j'étais un jeune élève officier. Et bon, je vous dis pas que j'ai un âge immémorial, c'est pas ça que je vous dis parce que ces principes-là existaient bien avant moi. Mais pourquoi j'ai intitulé mon propos, là, la surprise est un principe de guerre, 3 petits points, c'est que généralement, la surprise, on tente de l'appliquer aux forces opposantes, pas aux forces alliées. Ça m'est arrivé, moi, à quelques reprises dans ma carrière, de dire à des états-majors, écoutez, messieurs, mesdames, c'est pas moi que vous devez surprendre comme votre chef militaire, c'est les forces opposantes. Et il me semble ici qu'entre autres, avec le retrait américain d'Afghanistan cet été et aussi la création d'AUKUS, on a été certainement quelque part surpris. Et pas juste le Canada, mais bien d'autres pays. Hein. Des conférenciers ce matin ont parlé là, de l'attitude de la France, entre autres, envers la création là, de la nouvelle alliance du Pacifique. Donc, c'est pour ça que je voulais parler de la surprise. C'est qu'il me semble, en tout cas, moi, que ces 2 grands événements-là ont surpris bien du monde. Et bien des alliés, ce qui ne devrait pas se faire nécessairement. Alors donc, il y a un conférencier également qui a parlé d'un très bon point à mon avis, en tout cas en ce qui concerne le Canada, c'est que pendant que ces grands événements-là arrivaient sur la scène internationale, eh bien nous, on était en pleine campagne électorale fédérale. Alors, bon, c'est le repli de Kaboul, la création de l'AUKUS, et nous, pendant ce temps-là, en pleine campagne politique fédérale, et on sait généralement que les enjeux de politique internationale ne figurent pas très haut sur la liste des enjeux électoraux qui sont souvent plus concentrés sur les affaires domestiques. Alors, sans que ça ait complètement passé en dessous du radar, avec la nomination du Conseil des ministres qui vient tout juste de se faire au Canada, eh bien, dans les derniers presque 5 semaines ou 6 semaines qui se sont écoulées depuis l'élection, la marche du monde a continué. Et là, maintenant, on doit un peu se rattraper là, sur la scène canadienne, en tout cas, en disant, bon, ben, il y a encore un paquet de réfugiés afghans qui sont en Afghanistan. Vous savez, on a dit, on veut en rapatrier. On est parti de 20 000, on est rendu à 40 000 maintenant. Mais là, il y a un nouveau ministre, 2 nouveaux ministres qui arrivent, puis la pression s'est pas diminuée, n'a pas diminué, au contraire. On est en contact avec des gens qui sont en Afghanistan qui disent, écoutez, on est là, on est toujours là. Je lisais dans les nouvelles qu'il y en avait autour de 1700 en ce moment dans ce qu'on appelle des safe houses, des maisons protégées, mais qui commencent à manquer sérieusement de moyens. Alors, ces gens-là sont toujours là. Et bon, malgré que parfois, on dirait au Canada qu'on oublie qu'on est une nation pacifique, hein, quand on parle de notre devise d'une mer à l'autre, ben, il y a une de ces mers-là qui est la mer du Pacifique. Alors là, il vient de se créer une entente entre le Royaume-Uni, les États-Unis et l'Australie. Moi, je me disais, vous savez, des fois, on rêve un peu, hein, je me disais, dans AUKUS, il va y avoir AUC pour Canada, KUS, mais non, on n'est pas là. Alors donc, qu'est-ce qui va arriver avec tout ça? On va assister un peu là, à un peu de rattrapage là, de ce côté-là, du côté en tout cas d'Ottawa, à mon avis.
Vous faites référence donc à 2 éléments de surprise. Vous parlez de AUKUS, évidemment, qui a surpris tout le monde. Le Canada, évidemment, faisait partie des États les plus surpris. Le Canada n'a pas été consulté. Peut-être, ultimement, que le Canada était bien content de ne pas avoir été consulté, notamment parce qu'au niveau stratégique, on semble avoir de la difficulté à se fixer sur de nombreux enjeux. En même temps, c'est facile après coup de dire « Hey, on n'a pas été consulté ». Mais donc, si on fait un pas en arrière et qu'on revient au grand thème de cette conférence, l'objectif, c'est de comprendre de quelle manière est-ce que les démocraties libérales, essentiellement les États-Unis et leurs principaux alliés, coopèrent aujourd'hui face à de nouvelles menaces, face à une recrudescence des tensions, bien sûr avec la Chine et avec la Russie. Alors, on aurait pu s'attendre au cours des dernières années à ce qu'il y ait beaucoup plus de cohésion et de collaboration, non seulement au sein des blocs, mais vraiment au niveau international. C'est ce que plusieurs espéraient. C'est le souhait que le président Biden a formulé pendant la dernière campagne présidentielle. C'est aussi le souhait qu'il a formulé après avoir pris les rênes du pouvoir en janvier 2021. Or, deux éléments de surprise auxquels vous faites allusion. D'abord, le retrait de Kaboul, qui était bien sûr prévu. Là. Il n'y avait pas de surprise dans le fait que les Américains allaient quitter. C'était prévu depuis février 2020, lorsque Mike Pompeo s'est entendu avec les représentants talibans. Par contre, là où il y a eu un élément de surprise, c'est qu'au moment où les talibans ont repris les grandes villes du pays pour finalement prendre Kaboul, ben, les alliés des États-Unis, qui depuis 20 ans avaient fait beaucoup en Afghanistan, et vous le savez beaucoup plus que moi parce que vous avez été en Afghanistan à quelques reprises, ben, eux, ils ont demandé aux Américains, ben, est-ce qu'on pourrait avoir un peu plus de temps pour rapatrier tout le monde, puisqu'on s'est fait prendre par surprise par les talibans? Et l'administration Biden a dit non. Il y a eu évidemment un sommet virtuel catastrophe là, à la toute dernière minute, et les Américains n'ont pas consenti à donner une semaine ou 2 semaines de plus aux partenaires qui avaient partagé le fardeau et qui ont fait beaucoup, tant au niveau financier qu'en termes de militaires sur le terrain. Donc, si on les reprend en ordre, là, reprenons ce premier élément de surprise, là, le retrait unilatéral de Kaboul précipité en étant ferme là, du côté de Biden à l'égard de ses alliés. Alors, dites-moi, avant de parler peut-être d'AUKUS dans un deuxième temps, quel est l'impact d'une décision unilatérale comme ça, prise par les États-Unis, sur la collaboration, sur le climat aussi, entre les alliés des États-Unis? Quel genre d'impact est-ce que ça a?
Vous avez raison, là. Vous savez, il faut quand même relativiser l'élément de surprise, là, parce que c'est vrai que le départ des Américains était annoncé. C'est dans les détails, je crois, et dans la rapidité. En fait, pour moi et bien des collègues, la grande surprise, c'était la rapidité à laquelle les talibans se sont installés au bureau du président Ghani. Et là, il y a des collègues peut-être qui étudient le renseignement militaire. Là. Il y a des gens du renseignement qui se sont royalement trompés ici. Là. Parce qu'on parlait, vous savez, à l'époque, bon, les talibans prendront pas nécessairement le pouvoir avant 2-3 ans même. On a entendu ça. Et ça, c'est peut-être, en fait, une expérience. On s'est peut-être fié sur l'expérience de 89 et le départ des Soviétiques, où effectivement, à cette époque-là, ça avait pris 2-3 ans avant que les Afghanistans, que les Moudjahidines à l'époque s'installent, puis bon. Alors là, on entendait ça dans les sphères de renseignement. Bon, c'est pas tout de suite, 2-3 ans. Écoutez, les plus rapides disaient, bon, ça peut se faire dans une fenêtre de 6 mois, mais pas dans une fenêtre de 2 jours. Alors, c'est ça, je crois, qui. Alors, donc, et quand on a vu vous savez, là, ça a fait les médias internationaux, les images qui nous provenaient de l'aéroport de Kaboul, où vous avez des Afghans qui s'agrippent à des avions qui décollent, ça ne donne pas l'image d'un retrait planifié. Bon. Non. Alors, et là, il faut mettre un peu parfois des bémols, hein, parce que là, tous les feux sont braqués sur les Américains. Je regardais, entre autres, la couverture d'une revue économiste à l'époque qui parlait de la débâcle du président Biden. Alors bon, le Canada, on a quitté l'Afghanistan militairement en 2014. Ça fait 8 ans. On est parti, nous, là, un peu en disant, bon, vous savez, des fois, là, quand on pointe le doigt, là, le doigt, il revient vers nous des fois. Il ne faut pas oublier ça. Là. Alors oui, peut-être que les Américains, comme bon, le joueur principal, c'est sûr, en Afghanistan et tout ça, leur départ a un impact important. Mais il faut voir comment les autres pays de l'Alliance, entre autres, ont quitté petit à petit, dernièrement, là, dans un intervalle, comme je vous dis, nous, le Canada, on a quitté en 2014. Et là, vous avez parlé de l'arrivée du président Biden. Vous savez, tout le monde se souvient là, de ce discours où on voyait en grandes lettres « America is back ». America is back. Alors, il y a bien des gens dans l'Alliance Atlantique, entre autres, qui ont dit « Ouf, finalement ». Mais ces propos-là, qui ont mis bien des stratèges en confiance un peu en disant « Bon, on va pouvoir compter à nouveau sur la présence américaine », puis ben, c'est pas les signaux que le départ de Kaboul et de la création de l'AUKUS ont donné. Alors, donc, maintenant, le président Biden, vous savez, dans bien des coins du Québec, on dit il faut que, je ne sais pas comment on va traduire ça, là, mais que les bottines doivent suivre les babines. Là. On n'a pas eu ce cas-là nécessairement là, dernièrement. Là.
To walk the talk, je crois, on dit en anglais.
Exactement.
Oui, parce que vous avez raison, à la suite de l'élection de Biden, très rapidement, il y a eu la publication d'une stratégie de sécurité nationale intérimaire qui a été proposée par Blinken et par le Conseil de sécurité, nationale des États-Unis, pour envoyer un nouveau message, un message clair à l'effet que les alliés des États-Unis, tant du côté du Pacifique que du côté de l'Atlantique, sont une priorité. Et si on s'attarde à ce document et qu'on le regarde attentivement, le nombre de fois où on fait référence à l'importance de travailler avec les alliés, de tenir compte des intérêts des alliés, est très élevé. C'est 30 ou 40 fois pour un document qui fait 17 ou 18 pages. Donc, c'est central. C'est vraiment le message qui est envoyé. Donc, s'il fallait s'en tenir uniquement aux documents officiels pour comprendre ce qui se passe dans le monde, on serait très souvent dans l'erreur parce que, effectivement, le retrait précipité de Kaboul, sans période additionnelle pour permettre aux alliés de se retirer, suggère que c'est d'abord les intérêts des États-Unis et bien ensuite les intérêts des principaux alliés. Donc, si vous êtes Canadien ou que vous êtes Français ou autre et que vous avez participé à ce conflit-là, je crois qu'au plus fort de la guerre, il y avait plus de 40 000 militaires non américains sur le territoire afghan. Ben, il me semble que la moindre des choses, dans une période critique comme celle du retrait de Kaboul, c'est de dire, bon, ben, on va tout faire pour renégocier avec les talibans pour avoir une semaine de plus ou 2 semaines de plus pour que nos ressortissants sortent. Et puis, si on était capable de renégocier avec eux, puisque ça ne fait pas partie de l'entente de février 2020, ben, nous allons, par la force, faire tout ce que nous pouvons pour aider les alliés au-delà du 31 août. Si ce n'est pas ce que vous faites, vous risquez effectivement d'envoyer un mauvais message aux alliés. Alors, quand on se tourne maintenant vers l'importance de collaborer ensemble face à la Chine, face à la Russie, j'imagine que ça a pour effet de plomber l'atmosphère et de plomber les relations au niveau militaire entre alliés. Et donc, évidemment, vous êtes brigadier-général à la retraite, donc vous n'êtes plus dans, disons, aux commandes, et donc je sais que vous avez un peu plus de liberté, disons, pour parler en votre propre nom. Quel effet ça peut avoir, je reviens sur cette question-là, sur la coopération et la coordination entre alliés, qu'une décision unilatérale comme ça menée par la première puissance?
Ben, écoutez, c'est sûr que il y a comme, je parlerais, ça dépend des nations. Je peux comprendre, par exemple, la position de la France, là, où on a, même quand on couple ça avec la création de l'AUKUS, on a reçu une véritable gifle, là, qu'on dit parfois dans... Bon, au Canada, vous savez, au niveau des militaires, les militaires comprennent bien que ces décisions-là sont prises à des niveaux stratégiques et puis il y a constamment de la collaboration puis des échanges qui se font au niveau des militaires. D'ailleurs, je veux revenir sur un point, là, quand on parle de surprise, pour avoir été attaché militaire moi-même pendant 3 ans, c'est difficile à croire que les gens ont été surpris, là. Ça veut dire qu'il y a des attachés militaires, quelque part, pour moi, qui ont été vraiment tenus à l'écart, mais il faut le faire, là, parce que, vous savez, le réseau des attachés militaires, on se rencontre souvent, évidemment, dans des activités formelles, mais souvent aussi dans des activités informelles et qu'on ait potentiellement réussi à tenir ce projet-là secret comme ça, c'est sûr qu'il y a des plumes qui ont été froissées. Vous savez, parce que là, vous savez, la confiance, ça ne s'ordonne pas. Alors, il n'y a pas aucun pays qui peut dire, par exemple, au Canada, je t'ordonne d'avoir confiance en moi. Alors, donc, ce sentiment de confiance-là, à cause du secret auquel, bon, il semble que toute cette entente-là a été négociée, c'est sûr qu'il y a des gens qui prennent. Peut-être qu'il y a des gens qui n'auront pas de carte de Noël de d'autres là, à Noël cette année. Alors, il faut comprendre que... Mais bon, vous savez, la collaboration existe dans d'autres théâtres d'opération. Vous savez, par exemple, les Canadiens sont en Lettonie en ce moment. Donc, la coopération au sein de l'OTAN existe encore. Il y a encore plein de Canadiens qui sont dans des postes de commandement importants au sein de l'OTAN. L'Union européenne continue de fonctionner dans des missions un peu partout. Donc, vous savez, le monde continue d'avancer, mais ce genre d'action-là laisse des traces au niveau, là, je pourrais dire, personnel. Vous savez, parce que même si on parle de les organisations et tout ça, au bout du compte, c'est toujours des gens qui nous représentent. Et il y a peut-être effectivement des gens qui se sont sentis froissés dans leur quotidien au travail, là, dans leur relation avec des gens qui viennent d'ailleurs. Puis en passant, avec la cérémonie là, du jour du souvenir qui arrive au Canada, il va y avoir plein de vétérans canadiens qui vont se poser des questions sur leur déploiement en Afghanistan. Vous savez, il y a eu 40 000 militaires canadiens qui se sont déployés en Afghanistan. On entend à travers toute la gamme, là, il y en a qui vont dire, bon, à quoi ça a servi notre déploiement? Il y en a qui vont dire que ça ne servait à rien, d'autres non. Bon, je respecte la position des gens, mais vous savez, au bout du compte, même quand les pays prennent des décisions puis des actions puis participent ou non à des opérations, c'est toujours des gens, hein, des hommes et des femmes qui sont là avec le drapeau sur l'épaule et eux vont être... en fait, il y a beaucoup de questions là, qui vont se poser très prochainement là, sur étant donné les activités de commémoration qui s'en viennent.
Vous soulevez, Général Giguère, deux éléments très intéressants, très importants. D'une part, vous faites référence au fait qu'au niveau sécuritaire et au niveau diplomatique, évidemment, on est tous interreliés, une forme d'interdépendance complexe entre nous tous. Évidemment, les alliés continuent à collaborer au quotidien. Les gouvernements continuent à se parler aussi sur une base quotidienne. Ça ne change pas. Donc, au niveau institutionnel, au niveau gouvernemental, il n'y a pas de changement, il n'y a pas de séisme. Mais vous faites aussi ressortir le fait que, d'abord et avant tout, la politique et les décisions sont prises par des hommes et des femmes, par des individus. Et que certains individus ont été froissés, ont été écorchés au passage par cette décision américaine de ne pas permettre quelques jours de plus pour permettre à leurs ressortissants nationaux donc de retourner à la maison. Et ça nous ramène à la notion de confiance. Et puis, je faisais allusion à la confiance dans les remarques introductives parce que tout repose là-dessus. Est-ce que nous avons confiance? Il y a Olivier Schmitt dans le premier panel qui disait fondamentalement, la France doute de la détermination américaine à protéger la France en cas de besoin. Ça explique en partie la force de frappe française. Et évidemment, au niveau français, encore une fois, le lien de confiance avec les Britanniques notamment a été fortement écorché avec l'annonce en septembre dernier de l'entente AUKUS. Donc, voilà, tout repose sur la confiance.
Et comme je vous disais, professeur Paquin, avec les collègues, la confiance, ça ne s'ordonne pas.
Non, c'est ça.
C'est là ou c'est pas là. Et quand on la perd, c'est difficile à remonter la pente. Là. Vous savez, quand la France, par exemple, a retiré ses ambassadeurs de Washington et de Canberra, on ne voit pas ça souvent. Et le fait qu'on l'ait laissé à Londres aussi s'envoie un message sur la relation franco-britannique. Mais vous savez, il y a peut-être des collègues qui prônent toutes sortes d'écoles de théorie de relations internationales. Là. Mais est-ce qu'on ne vient pas d'avoir une belle preuve que le réalisme is alive and kicking ici? Là? Vous savez, parce que je rappelle souvent à mes étudiants les fameux propos de Palmerston, hein, qui parlait de « on n'a pas d'alliés puis d'ennemis éternels, on n'a que des intérêts éternels ». Mais ce n'est pas ça qui est en train d'arriver, même de la part des États-Unis. Vous savez qu'aussi, parfois, on a tendance à oublier que le repli un peu sur soi aux États-Unis, ce n'est pas une nouveauté dans l'histoire. C'est seulement depuis la doctrine Truman que les États-Unis, finalement, ont décidé de s'investir dans les affaires internationales. Mais avant, vous savez, je parlais de commémoration. Quand vous regardez un monument américain de la Première Guerre mondiale, c'est quoi la date qui est là-dessus? C'est 1917, 1918. C'est pas la même date que nous. Quand on regarde un monument américain de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, c'est quoi la date? C'est 41, 45, c'est pas 39. Alors, voyez-vous, donc, ceux qui portaient les fameuses casquettes Make America Great Again, ils n'avaient pas inventé grand-chose, dans le fond. Ça existait, ce sentiment-là existait depuis longtemps. Et là, la doctrine Truman a changé les choses, mais on revient un peu vers cette position-là qui a marqué longtemps les États-Unis. Puis là, je ne vous dis pas que les États-Unis vont complètement délaisser les alliés. Ils ne peuvent pas, là. Mais, vous savez, quand il y a eu les départs précipités de Kaboul, j'avais été interviewé, entre autres, par des Radio-Canada ici, et puis on parlait de ça, puis un peu, vous savez, un peu de façon réaliste, je leur dis, écoutez, on en parle là, beaucoup, là, mais rappelez-moi dans 2 semaines, voir si on va en parler beaucoup. Voyez-vous?
Oui.
Alors que la situation sur le terrain n'a pas changé. Il y a encore plein de gens qui vont s'en venir au Canada ou ailleurs. Les talibans 2.0, moi, je ne crois pas à ça, mais du tout, là. Et donc, la situation n'a pas changé, mais on ne se réveille plus le matin avec l'Afghanistan sur nos sites de nouvelles. Et probablement que c'est un calcul que le président Biden avait bien fait là, en disant que l'impact de ça, all politics is local, comme on dit, là, que l'impact de ça sur la scène domestique. Et je fais souvent, parfois je rappelle vous savez, des fois, de faire un échange entre diverses disciplines, comme à l'école, hein, on est une école multidisciplinaire. Je reviens parfois avec, en faisant un petit parallèle avec la fameuse pyramide des besoins de Maslow. Et que si on appliquait ça à l'État, vous savez, les grandes organisations internationales, d'appartenir à des grands clubs et tout ça, quand on fait ça, on est plutôt dans le haut de la pyramide de Maslow. Hein? C'est parce que nos besoins de base et nos besoins de sécurité sont bien comblés. Après, on va s'unir, OTAN, UE, bon, tout ça. Mais moi, je trouve que si on fait un parallèle avec cette pyramide-là, c'est que la situation internationale, en ce moment, nous pousse vers le bas de la pyramide. Et le bas de la pyramide, à mon avis, c'est le domaine du réalisme politique.
Mm-hmm.
Et on l'a très bien vu avec la pandémie. Quand on a un allié pour le Canada comme les États-Unis qui disaient « on va garder nos masques pour nous, on ne les envoie pas au Canada », vous voyez comment en bas on était rendu dans la pyramide. Là. Et là, je pense que, vous savez, tous les chamboulements qui arrivent sur la scène internationale et peut-être en premier l'essor de la Chine, ça nous ramène vers le bas. Et en passant, vous êtes au courant là, de l'initiative 2030 de l'OTAN qui est discutée. Là. Il y a même un rapport là, qui a été produit à cet effet-là qui est très intéressant. Parce qu'on veut, vous savez que le prochain concept stratégique de l'OTAN devrait être accepté au prochain sommet de l'OTAN à Madrid. Mais qu'est-ce qui figure clairement maintenant dans l'initiative 2030? C'est la Chine. Et vous savez, on a eu au niveau de l'OTAN, en tout cas, tellement de débats sur les opérations hors zone, quelle est la menace, avant même qu'on prenne compte, ça fait longtemps qu'on sait que la Chine est là, mais qu'on en prenne conscience au niveau de l'OTAN officiellement comme ça, et probablement, ça va être intéressant de voir quelle va être la part de la Chine dans le prochain concept stratégique de l'OTAN. Mais je crois qu'on est en train de s'ouvrir tranquillement au niveau de l'OTAN, certainement, puis peut-être même l'Union européenne, que le monde, c'est pas mal plus que l'Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Et là, on en a la preuve flagrante, justement, avec la création de l'AUKUS, où, entre autres, les États-Unis ont pris l'initiative d'adresser ce risque-là ou cette menace-là là, qui provient de l'Asie. Alors que l'OTAN n'est pas très là-dedans encore parce que, vous savez, dépendamment à qui vous parlez au sein de l'OTAN, on n'a pas tous la même définition de la menace. Là.
Ouais, là, les
il y a des
perceptions
pays
diffèrent.
qui vont vous dire, ben, nous, on est près de la Russie. Il y a d'autres pays qui vont nous dire, ben nous, c'est encore la menace terroriste, les pays qui sont plus au sud. Et là, on rembarque la Chine par-dessus ça. Alors, comment on va faire pour maintenir la cohésion des 30? Ça va être intéressant à voir avec les discussions qui vont précéder et qui vont avoir lieu lors du prochain sommet de l'OTAN.
Oui, et puis lors du premier panel, Dominika Kunertova indiquait que les Européens, bien sûr, reconnaissent que la Chine est une menace importante, bien qu'aux yeux de plusieurs, la Russie demeure le principal problème. Alors que d'un point de vue américain, c'est la Chine et la Chine. Donc, j'imagine que dans les discussions là, qui vont mener normalement à l'adoption du concept stratégique, il y a des tensions et il y a des points de vue divers, encore une fois, dû au fait que les perceptions des menaces, mais aussi les opportunités que les États perçoivent dans cette transformation systémique qui s'opère, diffèrent considérablement d'un pays à l'autre. Lorsque vous avez la Hongrie, par exemple, qui mène des relations directes avec la Chine et qui est, disons, le poste avancé de la Chine en Europe, lorsque vous avez les gouvernements d'extrême droite italiens qui signent des ententes avec la Chine et qui intègrent les routes de la soie. Ça fait évidemment sourciller plusieurs observateurs, notamment du côté de Washington. Donc, il y a énormément de disparités dans les perceptions et dans les opportunités à saisir. Il y en a qui refusent de saisir des opportunités d'affaires chinoises parce qu'on craint évidemment que ce soit une sorte de Trojan horse, de cheval de Troie, oui. Alors que d'autres qui, sans doute, ont beaucoup plus de difficultés sur le plan économique, je faisais allusion à l'Italie tout à l'heure, sont très opportunistes et se soucient davantage du lendemain que dans 20 ou dans 30 ans.
Tout à fait. Et je voyais, entre autres, vous savez, dans le document qu'on peut lire là, sur l'initiative 2030 de l'OTAN, vous savez, on énumère 8 enjeux importants là, auxquels on devrait faire face. Là, parce que le dernier concept stratégique de l'OTAN date de 2010. Alors, il y a bien des choses qui ont changé depuis ce temps-là. Mais, vous savez, c'est quand même intéressant que quand on nous présente les 8 enjeux, quel est le premier? La Russie. Quel est le dernier? La Chine. Alors, vous voyez encore, on dirait que l'Alliance Atlantique est... J'ai bien aimé là, votre conférencier qui a fait une différence entre l'Alliance Atlantique et l'OTAN, l'organisation militaire, entre autres vécue en France. Là. Mais que, vous savez, c'est comme si c'est difficile pour l'Alliance Atlantique de bien percevoir, de bien voir ce risque-là qui se lève en Asie, en fait, qui est élevé depuis longtemps, mais vous savez, d'en prendre compte, d'en rendre compte, parce que si on a eu de la difficulté à intervenir en dehors de la zone, entre autres en Afghanistan, en Libye, et on a vu tous les débats que ça a soulevé, et il y a, vous savez, la zone Pacifique, il y a quand même des membres de l'OTAN qui ont une zone Pacifique, le Canada, les États-Unis, la France a beaucoup de possessions dans le Pacifique aussi, mais ce n'est pas tout le monde. Et comme l'OTAN fonctionne en fait à l'unanimité, hein, quand on prend des décisions, de mettre sur la table un concept stratégique qui va tenir la route en prenant en compte la menace ou le risque qui vient de la Chine, qui soit accepté par tout le monde, ça va prendre énormément de diplomatie de corridor, j'ai l'impression.
Absolument. Il nous reste 7 ou 8 minutes, Général Giguère. Le temps file. Donc, j'aimerais qu'on termine sur l'entente AUKUS. C'est un élément de surprise considérable qui aura sans doute beaucoup plus d'impact sur disons, le moyen et le long terme que le retrait précipité de Kaboul. Qu'est-ce que vous pensez de cette entente et surtout, quelle devrait être la réponse des exclus ou des laissés pour compte face à cette entente? Quel est votre point de vue là-dessus?
Bien, ça va être intéressant là, parce que, bon, les exclus, comme vous dites, vont devoir prendre en compte ce qui s'est passé et puis justement voir, mais alors, qu'est-ce qui se passe après? Alors, est-ce que, parce qu'on a fait beaucoup d'états là, de toute la question de la perte de contrat des sous-marins de la part de la France, là, mais c'est seulement un des aspects de cette alliance-là. Parce qu'on parle, entre autres, de partage, d'autres partages hein, de technologies avancées. Puis, bon, est-ce que, comme certains ont mentionné, est-ce qu'on est en train d'assister à la création d'une autre OTAN, mais plus dans le secteur pacifique, là? Bon, on n'est pas rendu là. Mais ce que ça démontre, c'est que les 3 pays Et c'est intéressant de voir que la Nouvelle-Zélande n'est pas là non plus. Il y a un des conférenciers qui a parlé ce matin de les Five Eyes. Bon, mais là, qu'est-ce qui va arriver avec aussi avec cette organisation-là? Parce que les Five Eyes, c'est à peu près l'organisation d'échange de renseignements et de partage de renseignements la plus tricotée, serrée qui n'existe pas, là. Mais là, on vient aussi de scinder un peu là,
comme le Five Eyes à deux vitesses.
Alors, donc, il va falloir prendre en compte cet aspect-là. Parce que, par exemple, vous savez, toutes les organisations comme l'OTAN, comme Five Eyes, ont des classifications de sécurité. Alors, moi, j'ai vécu ça, entre autres, en Afghanistan, où on avait du renseignement qui nous parvenait de l'OTAN, mais on fait quoi avec les Australiens qui sont à côté de nous sur le champ de bataille? On ne leur dit pas. Vous savez, ça cause vraiment des pressions énormes, surtout sur les gens qui sont sur le terrain. Là.
Ben oui.
Alors là, avec AUKUS, est-ce qu'il va y avoir du renseignement qui va se passer seulement qu'au niveau de l'AUKUS et pas au niveau des Five Eyes? Vous savez, c'est tout ça qui va arriver. Alors donc, il va falloir qu'on ait une bonne réflexion sur quelle va être, là je parle surtout du Canada évidemment, bien, ça va être quoi notre position envers, parce que là on n'est pas là. Est-ce que l'AUKUS va accepter, comme on voit dans d'autres organisations, l'établissement de pays observateurs? On voit ça dans le Conseil de l'Arctique, hein, où il y a des pays observateurs, ils n'ont aucune frontière avec l'Arctique, mais ils sont là pareil. Alors, nous, par exemple, le Canada, en plus, on a une frontière sur le Pacifique. Alors, mais ce qu'on va dire, bon, puis là, c'est pas clair non plus la gouvernance de cette organisation-là. C'est pas une organisation politique encore, c'est pas nécessairement une organisation militaire encore, hein, c'est plus une entente, là. Puis ça va être intéressant de voir avec l'OTAN comment elle va se mobiliser, là, comment elle va s'organiser en termes de gouvernance. Puis je pense que les gens qui ont participé, en fait, vous savez qu'en Australie, cette entente-là est très critiquée sur la scène locale. Là.
Absolument.
Hein, c'est pas le beau fixe. Là. Et je pense que les Américains se sont aperçus qu'il y a eu quand même du dommage qui a été causé là, en termes réputationnels parmi leurs alliés les plus près. Vous savez, il y a toujours un peu une compétition pour savoir quel est l'allié numéro 1 des États-Unis. Hein? Et bon, les Britanniques aiment bien penser que ce sont eux, les Australiens aiment bien penser que ce sont eux, les Canadiens. Vous savez, c'est pas clair, ça. Mais ce qui est clair, c'est que dans les alliés les plus près des États-Unis, on a créé de l'émoi qu'il va falloir calmer.
Absolument.
Alors donc, vous savez, il reste beaucoup de choses à faire. Là. Il y a beaucoup de viande à mettre autour de l'os de AUKUS. Là. Et là, justement, nous, par exemple, au Canada, maintenant qu'on a une nouvelle ministre et tout ça, bon, je pense que le champ est libre pour qu'on puisse contribuer à la mesure où les 3 membres initiaux de cette alliance-là vont bien vouloir nous accueillir.
Absolument. Il reste 2 ou 3 minutes, puis j'inviterai ceux qui assistent donc à cet échange à formuler leurs questions. On aurait le temps peut-être pour une question. Donc, en attendant peut-être de recevoir une question, j'aimerais revenir sur AUKUS parce qu'effectivement, certains disent est-ce que c'est le futur rotan de cette région? Il faut savoir qu'il n'y avait que l'ENSUS depuis la guerre froide, donc qui liait l'Australie, la Nouvelle-Zélande et les États-Unis. Là, on a une entente très particulière qui porte précisément sur la Chine et qui regroupe un État européen qui ne fait pas partie de l'Union européenne, bien entendu, mais le Royaume-Uni. Et c'est une première d'avoir donc cette espèce de triangle défensif, entre guillemets, face à la Chine, parce qu'historiquement, depuis le second conflit mondial, les Américains travaillent en bilatéral avec les alliés de l'Asie. C'est ce qu'on appelle le hub and spoke, où on a des ententes bilatérales et puis on y va à la pièce de cette manière-là. Alors que là, vraiment, on déborde cet esprit du hub and spoke en incluant un joueur européen. Et il faudra voir comment est-ce que cette organisation-là évoluera. Est-ce que ça tendra à l'institutionnalisation? Est-ce qu'il y aura, comme vous l'avez dit, d'autres acteurs qui seront amenés à participer? Mais chose certaine, du point de vue canadien, il y a des gens qui regrettent le fait qu'on n'ait pas été consulté et qu'on n'y participe pas. Mais la réalité, c'est que si on avait été invité, il aurait fallu être en mesure de livrer la marchandise. Il aurait fallu être en mesure de mettre de faire la démonstration que nous avons les moyens technologiques et techniques et surtout l'appétit pour nous livrer à ce genre d'exercice ou de mission militaire avec les alliés dans le Pacifique pour surveiller donc les agissements de la Chine. Est-ce que le Canada était prêt pour ça? Est-ce qu'il l'est aujourd'hui? J'en doute. J'aimerais peut-être avoir votre avis en terminant.
Ben, écoutez, vous posez un peu la question de la place du Canada dans le monde. Là.
Mm-hmm.
Et vous savez qu'il y a eu une certaine époque où, en fait, je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de remises en question là, qui doivent avoir lieu parce qu'il y a eu une certaine époque où on comprend bien que le Canada n'est pas une puissance militaire. On fait le travail avec ce qu'on a, là. Mais quand on compare, vous savez, les soldats canadiens sont appréciés partout où ils vont. Mais quand vous regardez notre équipement, nos effectifs, bon, on n'est pas une grande force militaire. Mais par le passé, le Canada souvent est invité à faire partie de clubs internationaux quelconques en raison de la réputation du Canada sur la scène internationale, qui avait cette réputation-là de, bon, mais si le Canada est là, ça doit être une bonne chose.
Ouais.
Hein, on était longtemps portés par cette réputation-là. Alors là, on savait très bien que si, par exemple, derrière des portes fermées, on demande au Canada, qu'est-ce que vous pouvez offrir militairement dans cette région-là, la réponse ne sera pas rien. Hein? On peut envoyer un navire, bon, on peut envoyer quelques outils militaires, mais pas une tonne.
Non.
Alors, bon, c'est quoi la valeur ajoutée? Et là, qu'on ait dit, qu'on ait créé cette organisation-là sans avoir un peu vous savez, l'aura canadienne dans l'organisation qui démontre qu'on voit bien que c'est une bonne organisation, le Canada est là. On ne s'est même pas cassé la tête pour cet aspect-là non plus.
Non.
Je pense qu'au niveau du Canada, là, on doit se dire, il faut vraiment analyser ça. Puis vous voyez, Mme Joly, qui a été nommée ministre cette semaine, c'est la 5e ministre des Affaires étrangères depuis 2015.
Oui, un par année.
Alors, il y a beaucoup de réflexions qu'on doit avoir sur notre politique étrangère, surtout dans cette région du monde-là. Et de là va découler comment les forces armées vont appuyer cette politique étrangère-là. Alors, je pense qu'on a beaucoup de pain sur la planche là, à ce niveau-là.
Oui, c'est le moins qu'on puisse dire.
Absolument.
Général Giguère, merci infiniment pour le temps que vous nous allouez. Merci d'avoir participé à l'exercice de cette discussion d'honneur, donc en plein milieu de colloque. Encore merci. Et puis, j'invite ceux et celles qui nous écoutent à revenir à 13h30. We will have our second panel at 1:30 this afternoon. The title is Canada's Defense Cooperation between AUKUS and the EU. Join us at 1:30. Général Giguère, thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Bonne fin de journée tout le monde.